Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The American Slave Coast, A History of the Slave Breeding Industry by Ned and Constance Sublette, narrated by Robin Eller. Although it is a record of horror, it has an odd, matter-of-fact air about it simply because the infamies that are described were so completely taken for granted. Bruce Catton, reviewing the 1965 edition of Documents Illustrative of the History of the Slave Trade to the Americas. Introduction. This is a history of the slave breeding industry, which we define as the complex of business and individuals in the United States who profited from the enslavement of African American children at birth. At the heart of our account is the intricate connection between the legal fact of people as property, the chattel principle, and national expansion. Our narrative doubles, then, as a history of the making of the United States as seen from the point of view of the slave trade. It also traces the history of money in America. In the southern United States, the peculiar institution of slavery was inextricably associated with its own peculiar economy, interconnected with that of the North. One of the two principal products of the antebellum slave economy was staple crops, which provided the cash flow, primarily cotton, which was the United States' major export. The other was enslaved people, who counted as capital and functioned as the stable wealth of the South. African American bodies and childbearing potential collateralized massive amounts of credit, the use of which made slave owners the wealthiest people in the country. When the Southern states seceded to form the Confederacy, they partitioned off and declared independence for their economic system in which people were money. Our chronology reaches from earliest colonial times through Emancipation, following the two main phases of the slave trade. The first phase, importation, began with the first known sale of kidnapped Africans in Virginia in 1619 and took place largely, though not entirely, during the colonial years. The second phase, breeding, was the era of the domestic or interstate slave trade in African Americans. The key date here from our perspective, one of the most important dates in American history, was the federal prohibition of the importation of persons as of January 1st, 1808. After that, the interstate trade was, with minor exceptions, the only slave trade in the United States, and it became massified on a previously impossible scale. The conflict between North and South is a fundamental trope of American history, but in our narrative, the major conflict is intra-Southern, the commercial antagonism between Virginia, the great slave breeder, and South Carolina, the great slave importer, for control of the market that supplied slave labor to an expanding slavery nation. The dramatic power struggle between the two was central to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787 and to secession in 1860-61. Part 1 is an overview, intended as an extended introduction to the subject. Part 2, which begins the main chronological body of the text, describes the creation of a slave economy during the colonial years. Part 3 centers on the U.S. Constitution's role as hinge between the two phases of slave importation and slave breeding. Parts 4 through 6 cover the years of the slave breeding industry, from the end of the War of 1812 through Emancipation, the rise, peak, and fall of the Cotton Kingdom. Note: this book describes an economy in which people were capital, children were interest, and women were routinely violated. We have tried to avoid gratuitously subjecting the listener to offensive language, but we are describing a horrifying reality. Part 1. The Capitalized Womb. 1. The Mother of Slavery. Virginia was the mother of slavery, wrote Lewis Hughes. It wasn't just a figure of speech. During the 53 years from the prohibition of the African slave trade by federal law in 1808 to the debacle of the Confederate States of America in 1861, the Southern economy depended on the functioning of a slave-breeding industry, of which Virginia was the #1 supplier. When Hughes was born in 1832, the market was expanding sharply. My father was a white man, and my mother was a negress, Hughes wrote. That meant he was classified as merchandise at birth because children inherited the free or enslaved status of the mother, not the father. It had been that way in Virginia for 170 years, already when Hughes was born. Parte sequitur ventrum was the legal term. The status of the newborn follows the status of the womb. Fathers passed inheritances down. Mothers passed slavery down. It ensured a steady flow of salable human product from the wombs of women who had no legal right to say no. Most enslaved African Americans lived and died without writing so much as their names. The Virginia Legal Code of 1849 provided for stripes flogging for those who tried to acquire literacy skills. A free person who dared assembled with Negroes for the purpose of instructing them to read or write could receive a jail sentence of up to 6 months and a fine of up to $100 plus costs. An enslaved person who tried to teach others to read might have part of a finger chopped off by the slave owner with the full blessing of law. So it was an especially distinguished achievement when in 1897 the 64-year-old Lewis Hughes published his memoir titled 30 Years a Slave, From Bondage to Freedom, The Institution of Slavery as Seen on the Plantation and in the Home of the Planter. Like the other volumes collectively referred to as slave narratives, it bears witness to a history slave owners did not want to exist, the first-hand testimony of the enslaved. By the time Hughes was 12, he had been sold 5 times. The 3rd time he was sold away from his mother to a trader. It was sad to her to part with me, he recalled, though she did not know that she was never to see me again, for my master had said nothing to her regarding his purpose, and she only thought, as I did, that I was hired to work on the canal boat, and that she should see me occasionally. But alas, we never met again. The trader carried the boy away from the Charlottesville area that had been his home, down the James River to Richmond. There he was sold a 4th time to a local man, but Hughes suffered with chills and fever, so the dissatisfied purchaser had him resold. This time he went on the auction block, where he was bought by a cotton planter setting up in Potomac, Mississippi, a booming region that had recently become available for plantations in the wake of the delivery of large areas of expropriated Chickasaw land into the hands of speculators. Slaves were designated by geographical origin in the market, with Virginia and Maryland-born slaves commanding a premium. It was held by many that Virginia had the best slaves, Hughes wrote. So when Mr. McKee found I was born and bred in that state, he seemed dissatisfied. The bidding commenced, and I remember well when the auctioneer said, $380 once, twice, and sold to Mr. Edward McKee. McKee had plenty of financing, and he was in a hurry. He bought 60 other people that day. A prime field hand would have commanded double or more, but even so, the $380 that bought the sickly 12-year-old would be more than $10,000 in 2014 money. Like the largest number of those forcibly emigrated in the Deep South, McGee's captives were all made to walk from Virginia to Mississippi in a coffle. Southern children grew up seeing coffles approach in a cloud of dust. A coffle is a train of men or beasts fastened together, says the Oxford English Dictionary, and indeed, Lewis Hughes referred to the coffle he marched in as a herd. The word comes from the Arabic qafila, meaning caravan, recalling the overland slave trade that existed across the desert from sub-Saharan Africa to the greater Islamic world centuries before Columbus crossed the Atlantic. With the development in the late 15th century of the maritime trade that shifted the commercial gravity of Africa southward from the desert to the Atlantic coast, coffles were used to traffic Africans from point of capture in their homeland to point of sale in one of Africa's many slave ports. But the people trudging to Mississippi along with Lewis Hughes were not Africans. They were African Americans, born into slavery and raised with their eventual sale in mind. Forced marched through wilderness at a pace of 20 or 25 miles a day for 5 weeks or more, from can't see to can't see, in blazing sun or cold rain, crossing unbridged rivers, occasionally dropping dead in their tracks. Hundreds of thousands of laborers transported themselves down south at gunpoint, where they and all their descendants could expect to be prisoners for life. Perhaps 80% of enslaved children were born to two-parent families, though the mother and father might live on different plantations. But in extant slave traders' records of those sold, according to Michael Tadman's analysis, complete nuclear families were almost totally absent. About a quarter of those trafficked southward were children between 8 and 15, purchased away from their families. The majority of coffle prisoners were male, boys who would never again see their mothers, men who would never again see wives and children. But there were women and girls in coffles too, exposed, as were enslaved women everywhere, to the possibility of sexual violation from their captors. The only age bracket in which females outnumbered males in trade was 12 to 15, when they were as able as the boys to do field labor and could also bear children. Charles Ball, forcibly taken from Maryland to South Carolina in 1805, recalled that the women were merely tied together with a rope about the size of a bedcord, which was tied like a halter round the neck of each. But the men were very differently caparisoned. A strong iron collar was closely fitted by means of a padlock round each of our necks. A chain of iron about 100 feet in length was passed through the hasps of each padlock, except at the two ends, where the hasps of the padlocks passed through a link of the chain. In addition to this, we were handcuffed in pairs, with iron staples and bolts, with a short chain about a foot long, uniting the handcuffs and their wearers in pairs. As they tramped along, coffles were typically watched over by whip and gun-wielding men on horseback and a few dogs, with supply wagons bringing up the rear. In the country, coffles slept outdoors on the ground, perhaps in tents. In town, they slept in the local jail or in a slave trader's private jail. Farmers along the route did business with the drivers, selling them quantities of the undernourishing, monotonous fare that enslaved people ate day in and day out. Sometimes the manacles were taken off as the coffle penetrated farther south, where escape was nearly impossible. But since the customary way of disposing of a troublesome slave, whether criminally insane, indomitably rebellious, or merely a repeated runaway, was to sell him or her down south, drivers assumed that the captives would be dangerous. Coffles were doubly vulnerable for robbery and for revolt, so security was high. The captives were not generally allowed to talk among themselves.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?